Okay, welcome everyone. So as I was putting this presentation together, I was trying to figure out who's going to be in the audience, who's my target audience. Yes, so one group of people are people who are passionate about PTP like myself. Probably not a lot of you, but this will be probably just a review for you guys. There'll be a group of people who don't care about PTP at all, and you probably don't show up to the presentation, and that's fine too. And then the last group, probably the bulk of you, is you're interested in PTP, and that's where we're going to learn a little bit more. Oh, I think actually maybe there's a fourth group. There might be a group of hecklers, and we have a solution for that. So the people with the mics, you may think they just have a mic. They're actually trained bouncers. Okay, getting on with the presentation. So what are we going to cover today? I'm going to talk about some recent work, so things that were sort of published in 2003 and 2004, sort of update you on what's out there. There's a bunch of work that we're actively working on and will be published soon. We'll cover that. And then we'll talk a little bit about some future work. Okay, so what are some things that have been recently published? And when I say recent, say since the start of 2003 or 2023. The timer here isn't timing down. Okay, so one thing we published last year was the kind of a mouthful here, RP 2059-15, which is the Precision Time Protocol and Professional Media Applications, the Yang data model for our profile. So the Yang data model, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so the Yang data model already exists. And one problem that we sort of were coming across was, I want to be able to sort of monitor to see how is my PTP system working. And so some devices would have a control that says, I am locked. And other devices would have a control, which is the inverted logic, I am unlocked. And then a third set of devices wouldn't have a control at all. And so this makes it very difficult to sort of monitor your devices. So what we sort of came up with this recommended practice is, here are parameters that every device should support. So every device should have a I'm locked parameter, and we should encode it in the same way. And this will make it very easy then for monitoring systems to talk to all the different devices and be able to status the network. So we came up with a list of here are the parameters you should have and their encodings. Now, one note is that we describe this data model, but we don't say how to get that information out of the product. There's lots of different ways that devices want to be controlled. We didn't want to sort of tackle that initially. So we just enumerated, here are the controls and their enumerations. So one thing you should do is that if you're buying equipment that supports PTP, you should ask the vendors, do you support RP 2059-15? So as a end user, you should be asking your vendors to do this. As a vendor, you should just be adding this to your products before the end users are asking about it. So kind of a two-way street there. So here's an example of the sort of the Yang data model for something called the communication mode. And so there's different values. 0 means that it's running in this multicast mode. If the value is up to 1, it's running in a multicast with a different sort of negotiation, or we're running in a unicast mode, or you're running in simply mixed mode. So just a description and an enumeration, and that's what this data model is about. Oh, can I go backwards? One thing, unfortunately, for some reason on the SMPTE website, you can't actually search for this. I did a search, I know it's there, and I can't find it. So if you use the link I put there, it'll bring you to the document. If you're a SMPTE member, all the standards are free, so you can just happily download this if you're a SMPTE member. So it is a little bit hard to find, but that link on the slide there will take you to the documents. Okay, another thing that we came up with last year, and it was actually kind of nice that Chris gave us that little plug there for the PTP security, so that will sort of cover that. This is a little bit easier to find. If you go to the SMPTE website, go to engineering reports, and then just do a search on the PTP, you'll come up with this one. This report, because it is an engineering report, is free to everybody. And if you want to just go to the direct link, I've included that, which is a little bit cryptic, but that's what it is. So in this study report, it's actually our second study report. The first one basically enumerated, here are different threats, and that's as far as we got. We came up with the second report, and it sort of focuses on how can we mitigate the threats. So if we look at sort of the index of the report, first of all, we have a bit of background information. Then we go through and identify the threats and how to mitigate them and controls. We also have a section that talks about what are some best practices as they relate to PTP security. And then lastly, some future work that we might want to do. So we're looking what kind of threats that we're worried about. So ultimately, we're worried about someone trying to disrupt the essence, so the video and the audio signal. How are they going to do this? They might attack the essence directly, just kind of outside the scope of PTP. They might attack our control and management system. So log into the control of a device. You can do all kinds of havoc then. Or you might be sort of attacking the timing system. So if you're attacking the timing system, you're doing stuff where you maybe want to change the time. So if I change the time to tomorrow, all my commercials won't run at the right times. My programs won't play at the right time, so I can mess up playout servers. I might want to try to change the frequency a bit. So if I offset the frequency by 1,000 BPM, time will still be working, but it'll be running at the wrong time. And a lot of devices don't have that kind of lock range. I might be trying to disrupt the timing distribution throughout the network, or I may want to try to stop the time distribution completely. So a denial of service. And then every device will go into a free run mode, and then you've got asynchronous sources, and it just gets messy. When we're thinking about this, we want to think about it in sort of a classic information technology security thing. So we have confidentiality as one of the parameters. Not a big deal. Everyone knows what time it is. That's, we're not keeping it secret. Integrity, that is important. We want to make sure when we say it's 2 o'clock, it really is 2 o'clock and someone hasn't changed it. And we also want to check availability if someone's doing denial of service, blocking the time. So yes, so thanks, Chris, for the little plug here for the threat cards. So we came up with a sort of a standardized way to make it very easy to look at all these different threats. So the threat cards are sort of broken into different sections. So there's sort of a nickname for this threat. There's kind of a brief description. There's what the impact is. So is it sort of falsifying the time? Is it degrading the performance? Is it some sort of denial of service type attack? A more detailed description describing the threat in detail. What parameters make your system susceptible? Depending on how you design your system might be susceptible to this threat, or maybe not. So ideally, you want to sort of look at the susceptibility and avoid that as you're doing your design. We need some way to know how a threat is attacking our system. So you have some various parameters and stuff you might look at. Again, this ties back into that RP 2059-15, because there's about 12 different parameters. If you monitor these parameters, you get a very good sense if someone's trying to attack your system. Not every parameter or every way of monitoring it is as effective, just kind of the nature of the threat. So we sort of have the next little block describes how effective is that monitoring. Because under regular operations, you might have something that looks like I changed from one grandmaster to another. That doesn't necessarily mean my system's under attack. That may be just a regular operation. Or it might mean my system's under attack. So you need to sort of, some of them you have to qualify the information in different ways. And then lastly, we want to look at how to mitigate, if this threat is occurring, how does one mitigate that? So diving into one threat card in more detail. So here we have something called a rogue leader. So this is something where I've plugged a device into the network and it's trying to become the grandmaster. Sometimes these things can be malicious, intentional, or sometimes these things can be accidental. So here it's going to try to, the rogue leader is going to be trying to use the BMC algorithm to take over as the grandmaster of the system. If this occurs, you can falsify the time and degrade the accuracy. There's a description. I'll let you read that yourself. So in terms of susceptibility, if I'm not using boundary clocks and I'm not using the role master feature, I'm susceptible to this. If I am using this boundary clocks and the role leader feature, then my network is not susceptible to this. Some ways you can detect this is happening. I see the grandmaster ID changes, so I know that the grandmaster of the system has changed. We have to be cautious because it could be legitimate cases where this occurs, and how we mitigate that. So in the report, there were 17 different threats that we went through, created a card for each of them. So they're just 17 nice little, easy to read cards. And then we also documented some vulnerabilities that aren't related to a specific threat, but they make your system much more vulnerable. So we made not quite threat cards, but made up some standardized cards for those. Okay, so what is some work that's sort of ongoing and coming up? So we're working on an update to the core 2059-2 profile document. So there is a new version of 1588 2019. So it doesn't sound, it's that new. So sort of also we call that version 2.1. When they created that, they wanted it to be backwards compatible to 2.0. They tried, unfortunately it's not, and it affects our profile specifically. So we're in the process now of updating our profile, the -2 document. One of the key things we have to do is we have a TLV message, which is a special SMPTE metadata, and we had attached that to the management messages. So when you send a management message, it would be as part of that. Under the new standard, that's not allowed. We can't do that. So now we're proposing to move that to the announced messages, which it is allowed. So that's sort of a change. The TLV is basically stays the same, but how we transmit it changes. There's this organizational extension propagate option. So it basically says we want our TLV, which is attached to announce messages now, to propagate through boundary clock switches. So there's a mode you have to turn on. So we're doing that. And also there's some clarification around the delay interval request field. And that's sort of just because of how we do unicast and multicast, there's just an extra clarification just to make sure everyone does it the same way. So we're very, very close, which I won't put a timeline on because it's in SMPTE, you'll never know. But I'll just say we're really, really close to releasing something called a public committee draft. And so SMPTE now has a process where before you wouldn't see the standard until it's actually published. And a few years ago, they came up with something called the PCD, or public committee draft process. And in that, we publish a draft version of the standard that is publicly available to everyone. And it allows, the committee has a certain number of people, a certain number of eyes looking at it. By releasing that to the public, although we make sure that people understand that it's a draft and not a final version, more eyes, more people can take a look at it. They can try to implement it. When they implement it, they may find issues. They can give us feedback. And that way, when we actually publish the final version of the standard, we can include more feedback. Now, unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure where it's going to end up on the SMPTE website. So I've posted a link on my website, which currently says coming soon. Once it's available on the SMPTE website, I'll put a link to it. But that link there on my personal website won't change. You can always go there and check. So how does this affect you, and what can you do? Well, as soon as the document is published, we'd like to get feedback. So if you're an early implementer, implement it so we can make sure we got it right. I'll talk about a little bit later about a future workshop we're considering, sort of participate in that. And what I would say now is that there's not a lot of reasons why you want to move to the new version, the 2019 version. So until we actually publish this and work through all these details, please stay with the 2008 version of PTP so you won't have any problems. And the other document we're working on is a best practices. So one thing about PTP is it works really well, and if you follow some simple rules, you won't have any problems. Early on, there's people, but one thing PTP does allow there are many ways to do it wrong, and there's only a handful of ways or less ways to do it right. So there's various best practices. And one thing we found is I came up with some best practices, another company came up with some best practices, a third company came up with best practices. We all call them best practices, so that's great. Unfortunately, they're not all compatible. A lot of them are very similar, but there's a few cases where they weren't. And within your system, you really want to follow one set of best practices. Well, yes, you can on an interface have different parameters on a certain interface, but we want to avoid that. So we want to have sort of one best practice that everyone follows. If each vendor does it, then you're sort of more vendor specific, I'll call it. So SMPTE's trying to come up with a best practice document, in which case all the vendors can basically contribute to it and come up with the one best practice to rule them all. Okay, so what can you do? So we're a little bit farther away from coming out with the PCD on this one, but when it's available, again, download it, provide feedback. And also I'll mention about that workshop coming up. Okay, so kind of I won't go into detail on them, but sort of these are about 15 sort of best practices. If you are interested in learning more about these, on Thursday, there is a course that's being run here. So at 12 o'clock, I'm going to do a deep dive into all of these. It is a extra pay thing. So there's 3 segments to the course on Thursday. I think it's like $50. If you go into your registration for MTS, you can say add on, buy the course. And that course, the first block is going to talk about 2110 for about 2 hours. The next block, an hour and a half, we're going to do a deep dive on PTP. And then the third block is another hour and a half, which is going to look at sort of more human aspects and how you run projects and motivate your staff and that sort of side of the business. Yep. Yeah, so it's PTP Made Easy is the name of that segment. Okay, so that's work that we're actively working on in the committee. Some of it's getting close. So what's some sort of possible future work that we're going to look at too? So we may want to come up with a third study report. One thing about the new version of 1588, the 2019, the 2.1 version, is it does have stuff about PTP security. And we may want to take a look at how does that impact our industry and what parts of that we wish to adopt into ours. So we may do a third report. And we're also considering a possible workshop. So this workshop would then test the updates to the 2059-2 to make sure that it works as we sort of expect it does. We also want to look at, as people are migrating from version 2 to 2.1, so you may end up with hybrid networks realistically. So what happens if you put a 2.1 device into a 2.0 network? Is it going to behave nicely? Or what are the challenges to watch out for? So we want to sort of make sure we learn those ahead of time in more of a sandbox before the entire industry runs into problems and gets unhappy and grumbly. What happens if I put a 2.0 device into a 2.1 network? Again, is that going to work? So we're trying to make all these changes as backwards compatible as we can, but until we actually get real implementations, we don't know. So we're looking to have this workshop and we'll have early implementers come together, much like we've sort of done previously with 2110 and with PTP. At this point, because there's not a huge drive to 2.1, we're expecting this workshop would maybe sort of late 2025, early 2026. So nothing super urgent, but we do want to sort of keep ahead of this. What can you do to help? Well, if you want to work on an early implementation using that PCD document, let me know so we can get you included in the loop. And if there's other sort of PTP stuff that you think would benefit the industry, let me know. We can then also include that in the workshop because we want to make sure we can get the most out of these workshops because having a bunch of equipment sent to some location, sending a lot of people costs money. And so we want to try to make the best of that time. Okay, in summary. So we talked about what are some of the recent works. So we've got the gang data model, which you sort of want to make sure as implementers you're starting to implement. As end users, you want to be asking your vendors, do you support this gang data model? And it's not that hard, just we need to get a bit more interest on people doing it. If you're interested in PTP security, we've got the study group report that's out. Look at those threat cards. I've done some of the presentations that focus directly on that. We've got the current ongoing work that we're getting close on. So we've got the profile updates. So check for that PCD document. We've got the best practices document. Again, provide your input when that's sort of published. And then we've got that future work coming, possibly that other study report and that workshop. If you guys have any questions, there's how to get a hold of me.